Hi, I'm Oliver, and this is Deep Cuts, a channel dedicated to music for lovers of music. So this is actually the first ambient album on the Deep Cuts Essentials list, which is quite surprising to me, to be honest, because if any of you have been watching for a little while now, watching the videos on this channel, you'll know that ambient is quite a big deal for me. Today's Deep Cuts Essential is Substrata by Biosphere, released in 1997, considered an all-time ambient classic. And I have to agree with that assessment because this is an absolutely stunning piece of work, a rich, expansive landscape at once intimate and deliberately icy. Biosphere is the moniker of Geir Jensen, an ambient electronic musician hailing from Norway, more specifically from a tiny city called Tromsø, right up in the north of Norway, which actually is inside the Arctic Circle. So perhaps the sort of expansive glacial quality of this work is already starting to contextualize in your mind. This wasn't Jensen's first music release though. He was releasing work and working with collectives, creating 12-inch singles and compilations that would fall somewhere in that kind of ambient house, ambient techno sort of sound identity. And this is a style you can clearly hear with his earlier records, for instance, his 1994 Biosphere record Patashnik, which has much more of a rhythmic focus and structure to it. I suppose it has some rhythms from a house influence. It clearly has ambient focus as well, but there's a definite sense of rhythm to that work. But this was about to change. Jensen signed to All Saints Records for the release of Substrata in 1997, and it houses some of the greats in ambient music. You have had Brian Eno records on this label, Laraji, Harold Budd, John Hassell, Rodalius, and it's not misplaced at all to suggest that Biosphere's music sits alongside these greats, especially a work like Substrata. The sonic journey this record takes you on is almost like no other. Now with Substrata, as I just mentioned, the early influence of house that Jensen had is almost entirely expunged from this record. The music isn't akin to something like Wolfgang Vogt's Gas project, where there is this minimal techno rhythm that kind of underpins all of the music, apart from maybe something like Pop, which is a bit of an anomaly of the Gas project series. But Vogt uses that minimal techno beat to ground the atmospheres that he creates, and this is not here in Substrata. Jensen entirely lets go of this form of songwriting, and he said he opts for this free-form, liquid method of creating soundscapes and atmospheres, and it incorporates that environmental theme that the album has and allows for a gorgeous spiritual listening experience. Passages of these melodious tones on the record create a confluence with the atmosphere that Jensen creates through his use of recordings of the wind whipping, the bow of a tree creaking against the power and the force of the natural world, or the distant waves crashing against the shore. The use of field recording samples presents Substrata in a different light to, say, the samples of lapping water that's used on the Noi record, because in that record it's pure relaxation. That is the feeling you get from those gentle sounds. If you haven't heard that record and you haven't experienced that, you need to go and listen to that so you see what I mean. Whereas here, the samples are at times quite violent. I think they serve as an oral reminder of the power of nature. I think that's a very important facet of Biosphere's work, specifically this record. But Jensen makes sure that these samples never take over. It never becomes a field recording album with some musical expressions thrown in. It never feels like that. He often places those samples somewhere further back in the mix, so they coalesce with the electronic and acoustic expressions that make up this album. Because of this, the overall listening experience approach, I think, to this record is one of cognitive awareness. You're always focused on what you're listening to. There's this general feeling of faraway intensity that gently trickles through Substrata, and it manifests as a sort of dangerous beauty. I think it wills you to listen to it and focus on what you're experiencing. It kind of reminds me of something like the Herco S record that I reviewed last year, one of my favourite albums of last year, and it's an ambient record that requires a bit more focus. I think you get more out of Substrata if you do that. It required focus in a very different way to the Herco S record, but it's not like something like Eno's Thursday Afternoon or his ambient music for airports, which wants you to kind of let go and just let the music wash over you. I get a different approach to something like Substrata. I'll be interested to see what you guys think about that. But that's the approach I've always felt with something like Substrata. I feel like you get so much more out of it if you really intently listen to everything that's going on in this album. That dangerous beauty manifested with the natural elements and also the musical expression, it's there on the final throws of the track Cabricia. You have this radio flickering on its medium waves as this lilting guitar tone and gentle synth drones give way to the sound of running water. And even when a more quietly serene sample is used by Jensen, such as the birds chirping in Uva Ursi, the music is lightly dissonant that accompanies it. It's subtly unsettling, which makes the bird sounds much more anxious. It gives it a disturbing quality that it might not otherwise have. And I really love the juxtaposition that he uses with these natural element sounds and the music expressions that he creates. The howling wind on Sphere of No Form almost sounds choral and eventually gets drowned out by these imposing Tibetan horns that are almost foghorn-like. Towards the end of the track, the synths become more serene, but they're still being punctured by those Tibetan horns. And this is one of the tracks that gives me such stark imagery in my mind as I listen to it. I get the thought of being stuck in this frozen wasteland, trying to find solace somewhere, and eventually finding this cave, getting inside, but the wind and the freezing cold is still whipping in the entrance of the cave. It's this powerful reminder of the beauty but also the danger of the natural world. And I love the way that the imagery can get conjured up from the music and from the samples that are being used on this, and I'd be keen to hear what sort of imagery you guys get from a track like Sphere of No Form, so let me know. When a loose rhythmic focus does appear on the record, like in the repetition of the track Chuck Hung, for example, Jensen uses two samples with contrasting tempos. So what this does is it forces the listener to let go of the beat, because you can't hold on to one or the other. It becomes, because they thrash against each other in some ways. And it means that you have to allow yourself to wander between the two different tempos, the two different repetitions. You're unable to attach yourself to either of those things. And I think Jensen wants you to feel isolated, out of your element in some way. And he achieves that beautifully there with just the contrast of those two different tempos. One thing I've kind of only hinted at so far is Jensen's use of instrumentation on Substrata. Clearly he uses acoustic instruments like guitar and Tibetan horn alongside the electronic soundscapes, so the synth drones, and he fuses those with the collage of natural recordings. He's incredibly good at doing this without making any specific part of the music sound out of place. I feel like sometimes with these collage style compositions that incorporate sampling, something can sound a little bit stapled together. But what I love about this music is there's a wonderful homogeny to everything in the palette that Jensen uses. Another different kind of sampling that Jensen uses aside from the natural world sounds can be found on track 4, The Things I Tell You, and track 6, Hyperborea. Now those of you that have seen Twin Peaks and those of you that have listened to Substrata already will probably recognise these samples. So the second sample on track 6, Hyperborea, is taken from the scene in Twin Peaks where Major Briggs is telling his son Bobby about a dream that he's had. It's a beautiful scene within the TV show anyway. It's one of the most emotive scenes, I think. But here, utilised on the record, it's ominously permeating that almost glitchy soundscape that Jensen's created on this track. And again, it has this duality of emotion because it's not quite outright creepy, but there's something dangerous about the sound of the music here. It's something alien and displaced. This operates on a similar way on the track The Things I Tell You, where Jensen uses a sample of the giant warning the character, Agent Cooper, about the future. One of the most melancholic tracks on this record, I think, and the synth melody echoes out and makes way for the giant to say, "The things I tell you will not be wrong." It's fascinating Jensen made the decision to use these samples from a show like Twin Peaks, because the setting of the show is very much one that's out in the wilderness, isolated from the rest of civilization. That's definitely a proponent of that show. And moments in Lynch and Frost's show pay specific attention to the wind whipping across the Douglas firs surrounding the town, or the owl calls in the wilderness. So there's a definite similarity to this record and that TV show. The final track on this record, Silene, is not perhaps what you might expect from this record, but it's a record that takes turns left, right and centre anyway to keep you on your toes, I think. But it's got a wash of melancholy about it. It has this underpinning of a synth melody that accompanies this strange far away, almost rhythmic sample that eventually disappears again to leave this isolated synth line. As the synth line fades away, the final minute of the track is this gentle clattering. Perhaps it's the sound of somebody working on something. It sounds like maybe someone working on a tool bench. Sounds like someone's taking something apart or putting something back together. And I'm not sure the significance of this final minute of the record. Perhaps it's reminding you that this record's being constructed by somebody. I'm not really sure. Let me know what your thoughts are on that. All in all though, a wonderful ambient record which really does deserve repeat listens. I've been listening to this album for years and it never fails to put me under its hypnotic spell. Thanks for watching. I really hope you will check this record out because it's fantastic. I would be really keen to hear what your experiences are of this album, so please let me know in the comments section of this video. We'll also be listening to this record in full on Tuesday at 10 o'clock BST on the Deep Cuts Discord. If you haven't joined that yet, come and join us. I'll be there as well. We're going to sit and listen to this record and see what sort of imagery is conjured up from this really interesting record. So come and join us if you're up for it. Also, just one quick final note. This video is for you, Cat. You know who you are. Thanks a lot. See you next week.